Our next speaker is Joshua Meeks. He's assistant professor at Northwestern University in the Department of History and Political Science. He has a book, France, Britain, and the Struggle for the Revolutionary Western Mediterranean, published with Palgrave Macmillan in 2017. He has a book forthcoming, congratulations, in 2019, sort of now?
Yeah, page proofs are waiting.
Okay, some work, but good work. Entitled Napoleon, a reference guide to his life and works. And his current project is Global History of the Napoleonic Era, and it's already under contract with Roman Littlefield. His paper today is entitled Corsica and the Ruins of Empire.
Thank you. And I'll say that just as a way of an introduction, what I wanted to do with this is not actually related to the current book project. It's more a thread that I wanted to pull from my earlier project in the Mediterranean, looking at Corsica. And so what I knew was that we have Constantin Volnay, who had a failed agricultural experiment on Corsica. I also knew that he has a philosophical work called The Ruins, or the Meditations on Revolutions of Empires. So I proposed this project thinking that I would find some connection between the two, looking at his philosophical work published in 1791, and then in 1792 his failed agricultural experiment. I didn't quite find what I was looking for, and that's okay. But ultimately, Volnay's failure in Corsica was so complete that it didn't actually give me any fodder to make any real comparisons there. So instead of looking at the initial kind of comparative element that I wanted to do, I'm going to pull the thread of Volnay's failure in Corsica just a little bit more. He leaves the island without ever putting these schemes into practice, but I'm curious as to why. And so that's what I want to explore in this paper. I'm going to first give a brief background of the environmental situation on Corsica, and then look at Volnay and his Ruins of Empire, and then try and put the two together, specifically trying to look at Volnay's failure and what this failure can tell us about the philosophy of conservation and the relationship between environmental and political autonomy that we find in Corsica. So to start off with, a little bit of background on Corsica itself. Throughout the early modern period, Corsica was under Genoese control, and this was a tempestuous and largely exploitative relationship, as Genoese administrators rotated in and out of the island, usually keeping any funds that had been given to them to develop Corsica as their own. They would pocket them. These administrators also largely kept to the coasts and the cities. Simply put, the interior was just a little bit too hard to get to. So the majority of Corsicans then regarded cities as alien implantations, barracks for occupying troops, and so left to their own devices, these mountain villagers, these rural peasants, developed an agrarian economy that wasn't based on the needs of any state, but rather on the exploitation of the limited resources offered by the different climate and soil conditions at varying altitudes. About above 600 meters began what the Corsicans regarded as mountain, as opposed to coast, and here chestnut forests provided a staple flour. Small fields of barley and wheat provided the bare minimum for subsistence. Mostly they relied on large herds of goats and sheep to give milk, cheese, and some meat. So by the 18th century, Corsica had become a drain on the resources of Genoa. They kept their hold in an effort to maintain some vestige of their former glory, but they put far too heavy of a burden on the island with too light of a military presence to take advantage of any of the island's, again, limited resources. This resulted in a series of rebellions, but between 1750 and 1768, there was a pretty successful rebellion at the hands of Pasquale Paoli. And this is where Rousseau starts to get really interested in the island. This is where he puts forth his constitutional project for Corsica. Ultimately, however, all these dreams are dashed when the French buy the island in 1768. 1769, they put down the resistance of the Corsicans, and Corsica is now French, though at a substantial cost for France. So following this French acquisition of Corsica, the Crown engaged in half-hearted attempts to reform and integrate the island into the French state and economy. Corsica was not actually part of France. It was in this quasi-colonial status. It was very interesting. Specifically, though, environmentally, a lot of these efforts were to drain malarial lagoons, to build roads, which were entirely lacking, to link the major cities, such as Bastia, San Florent, Corte, and even down into Ajaccio. Several royal tree plantations were started, specifically mulberry trees. But across the board, these efforts were met with pretty harsh resistance from the Corsican population. And it quickly became apparent that for the island to have any sort of self-sufficiency, much less to engage in any sort of profit, a considerable amount of time and money would need to be devoted to increasing the French presence on the island and then exploiting the natural resources. And the French did not have this time or money. Part of the issue was that the French didn't really actually even know what resources were available. One effort that I want to briefly note to remedy this relative ignorance came in the guise of a cartographic enterprise, the Plan Terrier. The instructions, and I really love the language here, the instructions to this mapping project says, and I quote, "Corsica is a devastated, depopulated country that must be regenerated. To regenerate a country is to give it the full existence of which it is capable in its population, its agriculture, and its commerce, not only in what they have been and what they are, but also in what they can become," end quote. The early reports, however, made it clear that the situation on Corsica was not encouraging. The plan found that 9% of the soil was good. 47% was mediocre, 24% was classified as bad. And that's not counting the significant portions of the island surface that were just water and bare rock. The crop choice, when it existed, was irrational, mostly fruit trees, which were considered a very poor quality. Given that there were no roads linking most of the cities, wheat was planted nearly everywhere, given that there was no way to transport the wheat easily. But it was only planted every 5 years, and in the periods that the fields were allowed to lay fallow, just the maquis, the tough underbrush, would grow back. They would then have shallow plowing that followed the burning of the maquis. And then on top of all of these issues, those large herds of goats especially would continually destroy the soil cover. Again, it wasn't pretty in Corsica at this point. To summarize, the Corsican environment under the old regime and under the Genoese, it was inefficient, it was underdeveloped. And to put the blame for this underdevelopment, I mean, we should put it on the Genoese and the French, who found it easier to pander to the urban coastal elites than to make any significant inroads, both literal and metaphorical, to the rural interior of the island. The beneficiaries of this neglect were the urban elites, such as the Bonapartes. And I'll follow up on the Bonaparte connection a little bit later. But I want to briefly note the impact on these rural communities. First, a clear and violent distrust for foreign intervention developed over the decades and the centuries, really. This largely stems from the Genoese period, but it continues into the 1780s, when the French were described frequently, the term that was used was swarm of locusts descending on the island in an attempt to earn profit. I think that's probably a little bit of a mischaracterization. The French were not as exploitative as the Genoese, but the perception still remained. The second point that I want to note is that in an effort to make use of the meager offerings afforded by the land, the rural Corsican land ownership was just very communal. This isn't a particular surprise, but it is important to note. So the end result was a fractious society in Corsica beset by constant infighting, but also a society that prided itself on autonomy, even if that autonomy came at the cost of a subsistence standard of living. By 1789, the island was costing the French government roughly 900,000 livres a year. Part of this was the disproportionate military cost of maintaining a notoriously unruly island, but a large part of this was also that Corsica contributed virtually nothing to its own upkeep, much less to the coffers in Paris or Versailles. In 1789, there was some hope that this relationship would change, as Corsica was finally integrated into the French state proper. So now, rather than relying on these external administrators where you might see some of the developmental funds disappear, now you have the Corsican municipal councils empowered to be responsible for the success of the island. And one important element of this, there was a lot of changes that took place in 1789 and 90, but one that I want to note in particular was the issue of land ownership again. Upon taking control of the island from the Genoese, the crown took over a lot of the land that was owned by the Genoese. Royal concessions were granted for these lands, but in 1790, a lot of these royal concessions were actually given to the municipal councils to disperse as they saw fit. And that'll become significant in just a little bit. So this was the Corsica that Volnay saw. Constantin Volnay, he's if you're not familiar with him, he was a noble philosophe, made his name in the 1780s as a travel writer. He went to Syria and Egypt, early kind of form of ethnography, really. In 1789 and 90, as a member of the National Assembly, he was vocal in his support for the proposal by Mirabeau for integrating Corsica into the French state proper. He actually then arranged to be appointed as the Director General of Trade and Agriculture in Corsica. And I'll note here, he had never been to the island. This was sight unseen. But in late 1791, he sets out to explore his new domain, to cast his vision for the island. So what actually was this vision? Well, in 1791, as I mentioned, Volnay had just published what would become probably his most well-known text, The Ruins, or Meditations on the Revolutions of Empires. It's a fascinating book that I highly recommend reading. I'm going to go through just a few salient parts of it. In the ruins, a genie that appears to Volnay lays out the trajectory of human history and explores and explains those natural laws that bound human endeavors. These laws were, according to Volnay's genie, largely related to enlightened self-interest. Empires are ruined when internal organization stands in the way of self-interest. The genie claims that society is only as strong as the self-interest of those individuals within that society, and that it is self-interest which binds the individual into the collective, so long as that collective is providing a context conducive to the furthering of that self-interest. Throughout history, civilizations rise on the basis of common interests and mutual needs. They thrive as long as they manage to service those interests and meet those needs. They decline as soon as one section of that society begins to pursue short-term gain at the expense of the collective good. And I want to credit Alexander Cook for helping me with a lot of the close reading of Volnay's text. It was very, very helpful there. This final point, though, about the decline of empires is crucial for Volnay, especially as a revolutionary. In The Ruins, Volnay argues that privileged classes who profit off of the labor of others are parasites, and that, and I quote, "All vices, all political disorders reduce to this, men who do nothing and devour the substance of others." End quote. This was unenlightened self-interest, more interested in the short-term accumulation of luxury than in any sort of long-term interests. He says again, and I quote, "Cupidity is the daughter and companion of ignorance, and it is the cause of all the evils that have desolated the earth. In short," end quote, "in short, it is short-term interest that is the enemy of progress." Now, as I said, this is just a brief look at Ruins. He actually spends much more time in the text railing against religion. That is his big bugbear, really, and singing the praises of print communication. Again, very fascinating book. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. But I'm going to mostly leave that aside for now. Those are some of the threads that I'm not going to pull today. For our purposes, I want to follow this line of Volnay as a scientist philosopher examining the decline of civilizations. So this is Volnay's social contract. And I mention that specifically because he sees himself diametrically opposed to Rousseau, privileging as he does the will of the individual. And though I can't prove it, I think this is actually one of the explanations for why Volnay is interested in Corsica specifically. I think he wants to rebut Rousseau and take one of Rousseau's projects, and again, Rousseau never went to the island either, and prove that he, Volnay, had the right of it. Nonetheless, and I don't find that specifically in Volnay's writing, that's just a feeling I get, but regardless of whether or not that's true, Corsica does provide Volnay a fascinating and important opportunity to put into practice his vision for a harmonization of man and environment within the bounds of self-interest. Where Corsica fits into Volnay's conception of the ruins of empire is up for debate, but it is fair to say that he viewed Corsica as the Plan Terrier did, as a project for regeneration. So it was with this intent to use Corsica as a laboratory for his ideas that Volnay sets out for the island. Interestingly, and I mentioned that he had been established as the Director General of Agriculture and Trade, he doesn't go to the island in that capacity. Instead, he goes as an individual and puts into process inquiries to purchase the estate of Confina. This is right outside of Ajaccio. It's pretty massive, really, by Corsican standards, measures around 550 hectares, and it was expensive. It was far more expensive than Volnay could actually afford, and this is another thread that I'd like to pull, but I don't know who else was investing with Volnay here. Obviously someone was, but I don't know who. But again, I think this is part of his motivation, is to go as an individual, as an enlightened, self-interested individual, not as an agent of the state. But this was probably misguided, especially because his stated goals here was to bring in crops such as sugar and cotton from the tropics, which would allow Corsica to prosper and succeed in linking Corsicans into the French state and solve that issue of Corsica not being profitable to the French state. Now, again, referencing back to the Plan Terrier, I don't see any record of Volnay actually referring to the Plan Terrier, which possibly explains his ambitious and optimistic plans for the island, bringing in sugar and cotton. Regardless, we also have a little bit of a mystery of why Volnay chose this particular plot of land. He had certainly never seen the property when he first made inquiries into it. One theory is that either Cristoforo Salicetti, who was in Paris at the time, or possibly even Napoleon turned him on to this particular plot of land. And I'll get back to this in a little bit. Regardless, Confina was a property with a convoluted history of ownership. In the interests of time, I do want to kind of distill this into what we know and avoid some of the speculation. But in 1778, it was owned by a Georges Stephanopoli, who was the chief of the Greek colony on Corsica, Paumi. Ownership then passed, as far as we can tell, to his son Jean, who shows up protesting that he's not getting anything out of the land. This is because neither Georges nor Jean was actually using the land. Instead, the land was being used by the neighboring rural peasant communities, specifically using it as pasture land for cattle and horses. And in 1790, we actually hear a petition from these peasants to the municipal assembly saying we should be granted use of this land. And in 1791, they go a step further, and I'll refer back to this in a little bit, but they specifically call for the land to be set apart as communal land, specifically saying not in the ownership of one person. In 1792, late 1791, early 1792, Volnay comes in and attempts to buy the land. But this was stymied by Stephanopoli. And this is where it gets really muddled and complicated. But to just move on, let's just say that Volnay can't buy the land. He tries over and over again through a variety of different measures to get the municipal assembly to sell him the land. At one point in early 1792, he actually petitions for Stephanopoli to be given the land so that Stephanopoli can then sell it to Volnay. This is denied. And this is kind of what I want to try and explain a little bit. The end result is that in March of 1793, Volnay's gone. Volnay leaves Corsica, never returns, proceeds to pen an incredibly vitriolic diatribe against the politicians on Corsica who he thinks thwarted him, but he never plants anything as far as we can tell. As far as I can tell, he never actually even sets foot on the land. There's again some dispute there. But this is theoretically the end of Volnay in Corsica. Hence why I was a little bit disappointed when I found this. I was like, well, how am I going to write a paper on this? But I will say that I want to look at two main theories about why Volnay was unable to even purchase the land in Corsica. First, we can take Volnay's opinion, what Volnay thinks about why he was not able to buy the land. He argues that there was a cabal seeking to hijack Confina from him. Interestingly, and this is where I'll bring back in the Bonapartes, if that was the case, it was almost definitely led by the Bonapartes. It was almost impossible not to be, as Joseph was on the Ajaccio Municipal Assembly. Napoleon, as the colonel of the National Guard, would have had those farmers who were making use of Confina in his National Guard group. And if you want a little bit more evidence to this particular conspiracy theory, the end of the story for the Confina estate in the Revolution is that it ends up in the hands of one Joseph Fesch, who is Napoleon's uncle. So one way or another, it does come back to Napoleon, as always seems to be the case when I talk about Corsica. But if this is true, that there is some elite cabal trying to stop Volnay from actually making use of the land, this fits well within his conception of the ruins of empire, or the ruins in general. This is a privileged interest, the Bonapartes in this case, denying industrious individuals, Volnay himself, the ability to pursue his enlightened self-interest. Corsica was ruined. This is the opinion of Volnay himself. This is what he publishes, this is what he talks about when he gets back into France. But it's interesting that he focuses almost entirely here on the politics of Corsica. When he writes his diatribe, he doesn't talk about Corsica through the lens of his philosophy. He doesn't talk about the environment on Corsica. He only rails against Paoli, Pozzo di Borgo, even Salicetti. He really, really dislikes the Corsicans after this. The alternative hypothesis, and the one that I want to kind of land on, is that there was very real resistance to Volnay's ownership of Confina, but it wasn't based on a secret cabal that was short-term interests accumulating luxury, as he would say, nor was it based, as I initially suspected, on specific disagreements about Volnay's philosophical or agricultural beliefs. Rather, the issue is largely one of political legitimacy, even public safety. That 1791 note that the Confina, that the rural communities gave to the municipal assembly said, this is a direct quote, "Troubles would arise every day if a single person were to obtain Confina." A threat. And indeed, there are records later on in the municipal assembly of violence having to be used to actually make use of any of the land on Confina. Keep in mind, this is Corsica this is the closest that Corsica has come to autonomy in decades, if not centuries, and the government was less concerned with regeneration and more concerned with survival and legitimacy. The long-term interests of Corsica were not found in cotton or in sugar, but in recovering from decades, even centuries of subjugation. Volnay, a distant, absentee Frenchman, looked eerily similar to the swarms of locusts or the Genoese. Resistance to Volnay's attempts to regenerate the island came not from a resistance to the specific project, but from a resistance to Volnay himself. Now, there's a few other kind of end points that I'd love to go to, but I want to actually give Volnay the last word here a little bit. When in 1793 he makes his way back to France, he publishes an addendum to the Ruins of Empire entitled The Laws of Nature. And he concludes that text with the following lines. I conclude that we are not happy except when we observe the rules established by nature for the purpose of our conservation, and that all wisdom, all perfection, all law, all virtue, all philosophy consist in the practice of these axioms founded on our own organization. Conserve yourself, instruct yourself, moderate yourself, and live for others so that they may live for you. So I'll end there, and I'm happy to pull some of those other threads if we have time in the Q&A. So, thank you.